Hello everyone, welcome back to Sigil. My name is Kevbot, and this is the fourth episode in my series on the history of D&D, one book at a time, where I take an anthropological approach to understanding the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it. In this episode, I'm going to analyze the spread of and reaction to Dungeons & Dragons as it was adopted by gamers throughout 1975, as well as the writing, release, and reaction to the first two supplements released for the game throughout the year, Greyhawk and Blackmoor. We will also take a look at the growth and change of Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, throughout 1975, and its shift from a partnership to a company. We've got a ton of information to cover today, so let's get started. We left off in the last video at the end of 1974. By December 1974, TSR had managed to sell its first printing of 1,000 copies of Dungeons & Dragons and ordered a second printing of 1,000 copies, thanks in large part to Gen Con 7 spreading word of the game around the country. Due to the increasing sales of D&D, TSR was also able to begin publishing other games by the end of 1974, such as Warriors of Mars and Tricolor, in total grossing roughly $12,000 in sales throughout the year. Gary Gygax would write about the current state of TSR in the January 1975 edition of Europa, noting that TSR is run from the home of Mr. K at present. Orders come into that address at an average of perhaps 10 per day, although that total includes orders from stores and distributors, so it gives no real picture of what volume we move. Mr. K handles from 50 to 75 orders per week. Between 1 and 2 letters per day are sent to TSR, inquiring about one thing or another. I handled about 60% of these inquiries, with the balance being handled by either Mr. K or Mr. Bloom. Although they were still only a partnership at this point, Gygax was right that they were currently considering the possible advantages of incorporation, and that the main barrier to growing TSR remained managing to get enough cash to keep up with the tremendous amount of rules and games we have waiting for publication. Thankfully for TSR, the growth seen throughout 1974 would continue into 1975. While the first 1,000 copies of D&D took 11 months to sell, the second printing of 1,000 copies would sell out in 5 months, necessitating a third printing by April and a fourth printing by November of 1975. However, before the success was fully realized, tragedy would strike on the last day of January 1975. Had a very nasty blow Friday. My old-time buddy and partner, Don K., had a fatal heart attack in the morning. Died within about an hour of the occurrence. At just 36 years of age, the death of Don K. would have a profound impact on both Gary and TSR. For Gary, he had lost one of his closest and longest childhood friends. For TSR, it would lose one of its founding partners, its president, treasurer, and the most business-minded director. This loss would require Gygax to step in and fill the void left behind, a role that he was hardly qualified for. Don's one-third share in the partnership would be inherited by his widow, Donna K. As Don had just the year before borrowed against his life insurance to invest $1,000 into TSR, it was all Donna was left with to support herself and their 2 children. But by February of 1975, what value would one-third of TSR have? An internal analysis of TSR completed February 1st, 1975, estimates roughly $12,000 worth of products in the K Garage, 750 copies of D&D's second printing, half of the initial printings of Tricolor and Warriors of Mars, and some new releases for 1975, including Star Probe and the Strategic Review. Factoring in estimated subjective intangibles such as growth potential and goodwill, they valued TSR to be worth $27,000 at this point. While more than the initial estimate of D&D being, at best, a $300 idea, it was an evaluation that would make buying out Donna's shares of the company, at this point, all but impossible for Gygax and Bloom, which would become a continuing source of frustration for all 3 involved. If TSR was going to survive as a company, it would need to press forward in spite of this major internal disruption to meet its planned releases for 1975, as any delay in sales of new products could lead to an unrecoverable debt to the printer. In a letter from Gygax to Arneson on February 12, 1975, Gygax summarized the planned release schedule as follows: Chainmail this week, Panzer Warfare in about 3 weeks, Greyhawk in about 5 weeks, Tractics in about 5 weeks. Assuming those products continue to sell well, he promised that we'll get the whole of the Don't Give Up the Ship trilogy out right after Gen Con in August. Arneson, still living in St. Paul and not employed by TSR yet, shouldered a lot of creative burden throughout 1975 on projects planned to be published by TSR. Not only would he work on 2 of his own projects, a Crusades board game and his supplement for D&D called Blackmoor, he would also help with overseeing the products by fellow Twin Cities gamer Richard Snyder and Dave Wesley, Mutant and Valley Forge, respectively. As the co-creator of D&D, and someone so well connected to Twin Cities gamers, Arneson was the logical addition to TSR once they were in a position to hire outside employees, and Gygax will continue to write to Arneson about this possibility. Further to what I said, it is absolutely necessary for you to let me/us know if you would be willing to move out to Lake Geneva in a year or two. However, for Arneson's part, he still harbored some reluctance towards this proposition. It was only a short couple of years ago that Don Lowry had offered Gygax to move to Maine to work for Guidon Games, which would have been a disastrous move, with Guidon Games falling shortly after. I still shudder about how I almost accepted an offer from Lowry, and I'm very anxious to see that no other person can be put in such a position due to any actions on my part. But with the current position and uncertainty of TSR, especially in the wake of Don K's passing, there was little reassurance in these words. It didn't help that at this time, Arneson was still writing about his discontent of the final version of TSR's flagship product, D&D. In a letter to Tony Bath at this time, he would write, "I am certainly not in the most desirable position of saying D&D is a perfect set of rules. They are far from it. In fact, they are very susceptible to being wrecked by a poor referee due to the poor layout and explanations." While TSR may have been facing struggles at the start of 1975, the good news was that D&D continued to spread around the country, and probably most importantly, to the West Coast and Los Angeles science fiction community, thanks largely to Owen and Hilda Hannafin. Owen and Hilda were early adopters of D&D, proficient contributors to APA-L, and friends of Lee and Barry Gold. In December 1974, the Golds were attending a party with the Hannafins, along with Marion Zimmer Bradley and Matthew Tepper, where Lee first saw them playing Dungeons & Dragons. Although they didn't play themselves and only observed, Lee would write, "Barry may be getting hooked by that game." However, this game would stick with the Golds, and a few weeks later in APA-L 508, published February 6, 1975, Lee wrote, "We got a lightning visit this week from the Hannafins. Hilda and Owen stayed 28 hours and then headed back to San Francisco. After showing them the clubhouse, they dug out their Dungeons & Dragons rules and introduced us to the game. Before they left, they let us have 2 Xeroxes of the rules, one for us and one for LASFS. Since most APA-L contributors do not seem to have ever played Dungeons & Dragons, I will run an account of our game through APA-L." Lee's 3-page account of the game would cover everything from character creation to delving into a dungeon refereed by Hilda Hannafin, obtaining some loot, and returning to the town. The adventure through the dungeon seemed to focus less on violence and combat than suspense and tension, through exploration and social encounters. The following APA-L contained reactions of interest towards D&D, including June Moffat, who noted the connection between D&D and fantasy fiction, writing that she would love to see the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. Sounds like any one of the games makes a good adventure story. Joe Trimble, who drew the cover for that issue of APA-L, wrote that she would like to try Dungeons & Dragons someday. The interest of Hilda Hannafin, Lee Gold, June Moffat, and Joe Trimble in D&D is another early indicator that the game would go on to a far greater destiny than either Gygax or Arneson had anticipated upon its release. In the last episode, I mentioned that in an early review of the game, Jim Dapkus offered one criticism, being the lack of roles for female characters in the rules. I asked Gary what women's libbers think of the situation, and he told me that he will bend to their demands when a member of the opposite sex buys a copy of Dungeons & Dragons. When Gygax made this comment, it was in light of 2 facts. The first being that D&D was initially marketed as a wargame to the wargaming community, and the second being that the wargaming community, at the time, was overwhelmingly male. To fully appreciate the early adoption of D&D by women, let's step back for a minute and explore the lack of women in wargaming in the 1970s. In the April 1975 issue of Europa, Jack Green writes an article titled "Wargamer as Elitist," where he tries to understand why the wargaming community was overwhelmingly comprised of white middle-class men. He writes that he has met more women wargamers than black wargamers, and estimates at that time put women involvement in wargaming around 1% of the total community. Green believed that the racial disparity between black and white gamers could be explained through class reasons, namely that wargamers tended to be of the middle class, but this explanation didn't explain the lack of women. If interest in wargames was simply a matter of economics, there should be roughly equal numbers of men and women. To try and explain this, Green goes into some of his thoughts, discussing cultural, societal, and biological differences between men and women. He then invites his female housemate, writing anonymously, to explain what she thinks the reason could be. She also generally attributes it to innate differences between men and women, with women more connected to their humanity than men, but invites other women to write and express their thoughts. The next issue of Europa would publish the overwhelming amount of responses to this article and discussion. The article starts: Jack Green and his girlfriend's notes about women in wargaming caused a huge amount of replies. 10% of you commented it. Reason enough to quote at least parts of your comments, even if several of the commenting readers, somewhat illogically, wrote that it will be of no use to write something about the subject, since they nevertheless did. A first part is devoted to comments made by women. Aren't we polite? A second part will be written by men only. Sure enough, the first 6 replies are by female wargamers, and helpfully, Linda Mosca provides the statistic that 300 of 31,500 subscribers to Strategy and Tactics magazine are women, supporting the estimation that roughly 1% of the community were women. Following this, there are submissions from about 25 men, and while the individual arguments are too much to get into specific detail here, most of them try to provide some sort of rationalization while also trying not to generalize too much about the differences between men and women or the nature of war games. So, outside of an intellectual exercise, what was the purpose of this discourse? Well, by 1975, board and miniature war games had become stale. As mentioned 2 episodes ago, Tom Shaw wrote in 1973, "The war game today is still much the same as it was in 1952. It is my opinion that we have today far too many games on the market that are rehashes of old formulas. I've seen nothing startling new in over a decade." Could an innovation in board and miniature wargaming come around that interested both men and women? If so, it could open up and tap into a potential market otherwise undiscovered. And the first step in even figuring out if this was possible was understanding why women traditionally didn't play these wargames. Gygax could never have anticipated that this game might be Dungeons and Dragons. As evidenced by his early response to Jim Dabkus, he clearly didn't understand how quickly Dungeons and Dragons would cross this gender gap. So, why did D&D appeal to women in a way that traditional board games and miniature war games didn't? There's no simple answer to this, and an entire video series could be dedicated to answering it alone. However, the initial spread among women can be explained in large part due to the demographics of the science fiction fandom being much more inclusive of women than the wargaming community. In A Wealth of Fable, a review of the 1960 directory of science fiction fans estimates a fandom that was roughly 15% female, compared to 1% in the wargaming community even a decade later. So, as Dungeons and Dragons bridge the fandoms of wargaming and science fiction, it's no surprise that the women in this community would be drawn to this game. One must also remember, too, that many of the older wargamers rejected the fantasy elements in their wargames that rule sets such as chainmail introduced, and with D&D's optional use of miniature figures, it stands to reason that D&D would gain an audience outside of wargamers, and one more receptive to these fantasy elements as the game grew and evolved. Unbeknownst to the industry giants like Avalon Hill and SPI, D&D would be the holy grail that they've been looking for, an innovative wargame that appealed to women as well as men. However, not only did Gygax not anticipate this, it also clearly happened in spite of any efforts on his part. In that same issue of Europa, when the men are responding to the question of why women aren't drawn to board and miniature wargames, Gygax himself writes the following response: "I have been accused of being a nasty, old, sexist, male chauvinistic pig, for the wording in D&D isn't what it should be. There should be more emphasis on the female role, more non-gender names, and so forth. I thought perhaps these folks were right and considered adding women in the raping and pillaging section, in the whores and tavern wenches chapter, the special magical part dealing with hags and crones, and thought perhaps adding an appendix on medieval harems, slave girls, and going Viking. Damn right I'm a sexist. It doesn't matter to me if women get paid as much as men, get jobs traditionally male, and shower in the men's locker room. They can jolly well stay away from wargaming in droves for all I care. I've seen many a good wargame and wargamer spoiled thanks to the fair sex. I'll detail that if anyone wishes." Now, I have seen some people try to make excuses for Gygax's submission here. Some say he's being sarcastic, some say he's just reacting in anger to the anonymous woman from the previous article and her views on men in wargaming. However, I feel this actually does a disservice to the genius of Gygax. Firstly, there's no evidence here for him being sarcastic. And even if he is reacting in sarcasm or anger, it comes across as childish when read in the context of the other men and their responses. In my opinion, we can take Gygax at his word here, as supported by his daughter years later, confirming she believed that he was a sexist. If we accept the fact that Gygax was sexist, and in spite of that, was able to invent a game that would be so readily adopted, not just by white women, but people of all cultures, ethnicity, and gender identities around the world, even 50 years later, this reflects the genius that he, Arneson, and the other early designers at TSR had in regards to game design. These designers were not flawless, perfect humans. Like all people, they were complex and had their flaws, but were able to change the world for the better in spite of it. As we've seen with gamers in other communities, the gamers in the science fiction fandoms also began reacting to the incompleteness of the rules for D&D and would publish editorials regarding it. Lee Gold would be at the forefront of this, as Barry and her took it upon themselves to spread D&D throughout Los Angeles, with Lee refereeing her own dungeon and publishing editorials in APA L. Lee quickly realized an important distinction that separated D&D from any other type of game, that being the game is not a zero-sum game. The referee, or dungeon master, wins if the players enjoy his setting enough to want to come back and explore further. Therefore, with no winners or losers in the traditional sense, Lee understood the importance of the role of the referee to provide a challenging yet fair experience for the players, and the form that this would take within dungeon design itself. As the rules of D&D do a poor job at outlining this crucial concept, Lee would start publishing guidance on dungeon design and interpretation of the incomplete rules with this key concept in mind. Standardization of the rules interpretations became extremely important for early adopters of the game, as players would port their characters between the dungeons of different referees, so an agreement on running combat, awarding experience, and distributing treasure was needed. As for publishing rules clarifications for D&D up to this point by Gygax, he primarily published these updates in other zines, most notably Great Plains Game Player newsletter. However, by 1975, TSR was now in a position where they could publish their own newsletter. The strategic review would be a way for them to publish rules clarifications and new material, not just for D&D, but all games offered by TSR, as well as promote new games and connect with their customers and the community at large. As Bloom would write, TSR is not around solely to make money. The members of TSR are longtime gamers who have found that there is a good deal of satisfaction in creating and or publishing a good set of game rules or an enjoyable game. Gygax would write a regular column for the zine called Castle and Crusade, which harkened back to the Castle and Crusade Society, originated by the LGTSA, and was instrumental in preparing the final version of Chainmail. The first issue would also debut a Creature Features column, where many classic D&D monsters would first appear. In issue 1 of the Strategic Review, they introduced the Mind Flayer. Also of notable significance in the first issue is reference to the Dungeons & Dragons supplemental books being high on their priority list, here referring to the soon-to-be-published Greyhawk and Blackmoor supplements. From the moment that D&D came out, Gygax knew that there'd be a need for supplemental material. Back in March 1974, Gygax would write to Arneson to remember to keep notes of all new tricks, traps, monsters, treasures, etc. I'll trick out a whole new draft and send you a copy soon. And 1 year later, in March 1975, TSR would release the first supplement to D&D, Greyhawk, written by Gygax and fellow member of the aforementioned Castle and Crusade Society, Rob Kuntz. Although the name would suggest otherwise, Greyhawk was not a campaign-setting book, and is specifically written to be both an expansion and revision of the core game, based on feedback from players over the previous year, and serves to clarify many common questions that players had about the incomplete rules. The structure of the booklet is divided into 3 sections that correspond to updates related to the 3 game booklets in the original game: Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. The Greyhawk supplement would introduce many changes that would become fundamental to D&D. It included rules for new classes: the Thief, which had previously been published in the Great Plains Game Player newsletter, and Paladin, a subclass for the Fighting Man, as well as more monsters, spells, and magic items. Classes now had different hit dice. Instead of every class having a d6 of hit dice, magic users would have a d4, and fighting men would have a d8. Similarly, in the original game, every attack dealt damage with a d6, but here tables were added to adjust the damage dealt by different men, weapons, and monsters. Collectively, Greyhawk would introduce more uses for the different polyhedral dice than the original game. There's also now a greater emphasis on ability scores for each class. Instead of just affecting rates of gaining experience points, tables of intelligence and strength bonuses allowed magic users to gain additional spells, and fighting men to do more damage and carry more. This would eventually be expanded to other classes, such as the dexterity bonus for the thief skills that are first published in the April 1976 issue of the Strategic Review. Coinciding with the release of Greyhawk, TSR would also publish the second issue of the Strategic Review. It started with an obituary for Don K, and then provided some additional D&D content. This content would include a new classic monster, the Roper, and another subclass for the fighting man, the Ranger. Like how the Thief class was created by Gary Switzer of Arrow Hobbies, the Ranger was also created by someone outside of TSR, Joe Fisher. While he is credited here, TSR did not always provide proper credit for ideas submitted to them, as we see with the missing accreditation for the Thief class in Greyhawk. The issue would also contain an article dedicated to questions most frequently asked about Dungeons & Dragons rules, here clarifying parts of the combat rules, spellcasting, and awarding experience points. While the notes on experience points don't clarify much, the notes on spells gives a clear authorial intent. A magic user can use a given spell, but once during any given day. A magic user could, for example, equip himself with 3 sleep spells, each of which would be usable but once. The release of Greyhawk would be the first time that the D&D community would be able to react to the game en masse, and reception of the new rules, additions, revisions, and clarifications were mixed. In APA L, Mark Swanson wrote that these rules make results far more dependent on your characteristics. They also make treasure hunting far more important, which may be realistic, but doesn't improve the game as far as I can tell. However, he would conclude that most dungeon masters are using parts of the rules in Greyhawk. In the April 1975 issue of American Wargamer, Kevin Slimak wrote that the new rules, monsters, magic items were met with mixed reactions, but that GMs are using the new rules as they see fit. The fact that GMs were using the new rules as they see fit reflects the reality that D&D fans had already filled the holes left in D&D's rules ambiguities with their own interpretations and house rules, as previously demonstrated by examples such as the invention of the Thief class at Arrow Hobbies, and clarifying ambiguities in how spellcasting was described in the original rules. Lee Gold, seeing the spellcasting system exploited by players who said they could cast an unlimited amount of spells, invented a system of spellcasting that would put a limit on the amount of spells that could be cast through the use of spell points. Gamers choosing to use spell points is notable due to their active dismissal of the officially published clarifications of spell memorization, not just in Greyhawk, but also the second issue of the Strategic Review. Therefore, for many gamers, these rules clarifications came too late, as their own house rules were already entrenched in how they played the game. Nothing summarizes this better than Mark Swanson reacting to the spellcasting ruling in the second issue of the Strategic Review. I am a supporter of the slogan, D&D is too important to leave to Gary Gygax. Gary has produced other games in the past. The problem has been that they are not interesting in their full form. They tend to be flawed by simple, bad solutions to complex problems. Ted Johnstone, in the same issue of APA L, would agree with this sentiment, writing that it seems obvious that the game has now outgrown its creators. Like those other dungeon masters you mentioned, I'll probably end up using parts of Greyhawk. This lack of agreement in rulings and rejection of rules within the officially published material, however, would continue to exacerbate the previously mentioned concern that player characters lacked portability between dungeons of different referees, who would continue implementing competing rulings within their individual games. However, in spite of its mixed reviews and reception in the broader D&D community, Greyhawk undeniably sold well. While the original game would sell at $10 for 3 booklets, Greyhawk would sell at an even more expensive $5 for one 56-page booklet, a third of the material at half the price. But in spite of that, gamers would pay for it, and it proved that TSR could continue to get away with this aggressive pricing for future D&D supplements. The financial success of Greyhawk meant that D&D would not be confined to its original box set, and this would be the start of a long-lasting game franchise. In response to the ever-increasing amount of house rules and D&D-related submissions to APA L, spread of readership outside of the Los Angeles science fiction fandom, and the notion that D&D is too important to leave to Gary Gygax, Lee Gold would start a monthly APA dedicated to D&D called Alarms and Excursions. One could argue that Alarms and Excursions is the first D&D magazine, as even though the Strategic Review had been published by this point, it covered many other TSR titles, such as the second issue containing additions for Cavaliers and Roundheads, Panzer Warfare, and advertisements for upcoming TSR releases, Boot Hill, and Classic Warfare. A&E, however, would be exclusively focused on D&D. Lee Gold would publish A&E monthly, starting June 1975, and only ending with a final issue being printed in April 2025, sadly due to Lee Gold's health issues and failing eyesight. In this 50-year period, she remarkably only missed printing a monthly issue 4 times. The first issue of Alarms and Excursions would contain various different aspects of game systems from different authors. Lee Gold submitted the expanded rules fleshing out the use of animals in D&D, as well as her spell system using spell points. Ted Johnson provided rules for modern firearms and standardization for dice notation, such as 2d8 or 3d6. Mark Swanson wrote a set of special abilities to help with individualizing characters by rolling 2d6 at level 1 to determine different minor merits, such as a +1 bonus to sword use or a +2 saving throw against charm or sleep. Perhaps most notably is Michael Seaman's contribution of a proposal for a character type of Singer or Bard, a new class that added a 7th ability score to D&D called Inspiration. Lee would include TSR in the mailing list of Alarms and Excursions and would send the first issue to them. Gygax would respond to this first issue of Alarms and Excursions with a 3-page letter printed in full in the second issue of Alarms and Excursions, released July 1975. As we've seen with much of Gygax's writing during this time, he starts the letter with a detailed history of the creation of D&D, mentioning the influences of Chainmail and Blackmoor, and collaboration between himself and Arneson. However, now, he expands this idea of collaboration by saying it is an ongoing game, as the Greyhawk booklet shows, hinting at the continuing acceptance of community collaboration towards D&D through both zine publications and more official publications from TSR, notably the upcoming Blackmoor expansion. Instead of getting directly into the criticisms of D&D and Greyhawk, and the idea that D&D is too important to leave to Gary Gygax, he spends a considerable amount of time promoting the upcoming release from TSR, M.A.R. Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne, describing the whole of the professor's work to J.R.R. Tolkien's, and that its form was influenced by D&D, and I am gratefully flattered about that. When Gygax finally gets to the criticisms of D&D, possibly surprisingly, he seems to agree with most of them, saying, I too subscribe to the slogan, D&D is too important to leave to Gary Gygax. Whoever said anything else? It now belongs to the thousands of players enjoying it worldwide. Gygax goes further, mentioning that his and Arneson's campaigns differ from the rules found in D&D because each campaign should be a variant, for every fine referee runs his own variant of D&D anyways, and that if the time ever comes when all aspects of fantasy are covered and the vast majority of players agree on how the game should be played, D&D will have become staid and boring indeed. Gygax finishes by saying, if you don't like the way I do it, change the bloody rule to suit yourself and your players, and uses Lee Gold's alternate spell system as an example of this. Gygax actually agrees that Lee's point system based on the magic user's basic abilities and his or her level is a better solution, and one that I have been aware of since the first, but he decided on the rules in Greyhawk for reasons of playability, as spell points would have required a great deal of space and been far more complex to handle, so I opted for the simple solution. Lee Gold would have one direct interaction with Gary Gygax, a phone call, and I will let her tell the story here.
I never met him face to face. He phoned. I sent him the first few copies of A&E, and after a few months, he phoned up, and I picked up the phone and I said hello, and he said, "This is Gary Gygax," and I said, "Oh wow, Mr. Gygax, how nice! This is Lee Gold. I wanted to tell you how much we've been enjoying your game," and yammer, yammer, yammer. And he said, "You're a woman." And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, I said some bad things about women role players. And I said, "That's all right. You don't have to be embarrassed. I have never read them." And he said, "You're a woman." And I said, "We're really enjoying playing Dungeons and Dragons. I assume you noticed that if you've got the issues of A&E I've been sending you, and we've been having such fun with it." And yammer, yammer, yammer. And he said, "You're a woman." And that was pretty much our conversation for about 3 or 4 minutes. "You're a woman." And I finally said, "Well, it's been nice talking to you," and hung up on him because he couldn't seem to get past it.
As Dungeons & Dragons would continue to grow and spread, gamers began to question the potential scope of the game itself. Until now, the gameplay persisted almost entirely of dungeon delving interspersed with random wilderness encounters, or as Mark Swanson called it, the year of the Gilded Hole. But could D&D be used to create deeper and more exciting stories and adventures? In Wargamers Information, Tim Waddell criticizes this dungeon-centered approach to the game, writing, "When I first read the rules to Dungeons & Dragons, I realized that its potential knew no bounds. How many of us, while reading The Lord of the Rings, have wondered what it would be like to be in Frodo's shoes, or be Gandalf, Strider, or even Sam? To a certain degree, D&D allows us to do this. But what referee would be willing to put in the work to elevate their game to that of Tolkien? A world where everything is defined, almost down to a sneeze. There are several completely mapped towns, plenty of interesting townspeople, rumors, legends, histories, etc. A total fantasy world. TSR would rise to this challenge with their next release in 1975, referenced by Gygax in his letter to Alarms and Excursions, with M.A.R. Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne. If you watched my last episode, you will remember that Empire of the Petal Throne was a game created by Barker applying the rules of D&D to his homebrew fictional world of Techumel, a world he had been developing since the 1950s. While he had initially planned to publish it through Bill Hoyt's new game rules publishing startup, World at War, the two of them would instead work with Gygax to have TSR publish it in 1975 due to the tremendous scale of the game and Hoyt being in no financial position to publish it. They signed the agreement on April 21st, and TSR would pay 10% in royalties to Barker and a 5% finder's fee to Hoyt. Barker also demanded a custom royalty agreement that gave him a percentage of royalties for any miniature figures that TSR would sell based on the creatures in his game. While the game system itself is heavily indebted to the game system of D&D, it answers Tim Waddell's criticism of who would be able to go through the work to create a world on the scale of Tolkien for D&D, and became the game's first proper campaign setting. As the introduction to the game states, the book you hold in your hands contains a description of a fantasy world, together with rules for conducting adventures therein. Not only does Petal Throne offer an entire world for a campaign setting, it also provides a specific scenario where all player characters arrive in a small boat at the great Solani port city of Jalaka, originating from their presumed barbarian homelands. The characters would then be contacted for a mission by some non-player Solani character, with the nature of the character and quest being randomly determined by a die roll on the table. Having the player characters arrive to the world as foreigners works well to allow them a natural reason to learn about the world as they play and explore the game, thus implementing an aspect of exploration unseen in Dungeons & Dragons to this point. The scale and complexity of the world of Techumel meant that the game would be included with a pair of large 34 by 61 hex maps showing the known world and a detailed map of the city of Jalaka, raising the cost of the box set to $25, the equivalent of $150 in 2025. TSR publishing and promoting Petal Throne further confirmed their efforts at this point to continue to promote games other than D&D, with Gygax even describing the game as superior to D&D, and that TSR is convinced that we will never have another title which will surpass Empire of the Petal Throne in concept and design. Petal Throne would not be the only new title that TSR would publish in the spring of 1975, as they would be in a better position to start publishing more games, in no small part thanks to Heritage Models and its president Jim Odin. TSR would switch from printing their games through the graphic printing company to Heritage, which, as Gygax writes to Arneson, would save us about $300 on a typical run of 1,000, so we'll be able to use him for a number of booklets and increase production accordingly. Heritage would also accept inventory from TSR to pay for the printings, freeing up TSR to use their small sales profits in areas other than printing costs and start publishing board games. TSR would publish a board game to go along with Empire of the Petal Throne called War of Wizards, along with Mike Carr's Fight in the Skies and Dave McGarry's Dungeon. Being able to quickly expand into printing these other types of games, along with Starprobe and Mutant, Gygax predicted that TSR will absolutely dominate the entire fantasy science fiction market. As for Dungeons & Dragons, royalties in the first quarter of 1975 came in at $598.10, roughly $100 per month for both Gygax and Arneson. At this point, they were earning monthly in royalties what they had earned for the entire first half of 1974. Effective the start of the second quarter, April 1st, Gygax and Arneson would enter into a new royalty agreement for D&D superseding their original 1974 contract. This new contract granted them a joint 10% royalty on the cover price of the game rules or game on each and every copy sold, replacing the former 20% royalty on the sale price. Why the new agreement, cutting the royalties in half from 20% to 10%? In the podcast When We Were Wizards, Adam Turner and Paul Stromberg make the argument that this 20% royalty agreement was too generous, hindering TSR from turning enough profit on D&D to continue growing and also obtain the capital needed to buy out Donna Kaye's one-third share of the company. However, John Peterson notes in Game Wizards that the original royalty agreement was 20% on the sale price, and the new agreement would be 10% on the cover price. As much of the sales volume of D&D was to its distribution partners, such as Heritage, this would be an amount often less than half the cover price. And therefore, this new agreement was actually a slightly more advantageous agreement for Gygax and Arneson. Greyhawk and War of Wizards would be signed under the same royalty terms, offering a 10% royalty on the cover price to the authors. Even though Greyhawk was an extension to D&D, it was a separate product covered by a royalty agreement between its authors, Gary Gygax and Rob Kuntz, and therefore Arneson would receive no money for it. The exact wording of the royalty agreement for D&D, the cover price of the game rules or game on each and every copy sold, was unambiguous at this time, as D&D only sold in one form with one cover price. However, the exact meaning of the game rules or the game in this April 1975 agreement would become the object of differing interpretations in a $1 million lawsuit in just a few short years. As TSR would continue to grow and publish more games, it attracted more attention from the broader wargaming community, leading to Don Lowry interviewing Gary Gygax for Panzerfaust in May about TSR. Gygax's opinion on Lowry had soured over the past few months, writing in a letter to Dave McGarry in March 1975, describing him as a two-faced shaft master. So he used this as an opportunity to brag about his successful games company in comparison to Lowry's failed Guidon Games and their preparation for opening a retail hobby shop in Lake Geneva in comparison to his failing Lowry's hobbies. Sound familiar? Gygax taunted. Describing the current state of TSR, he would clarify that we all have to squeeze TSR work into our spare time, as that means most of the work is done in our individual homes. The work being done at the time was described as Dave Arneson is a research and design specialist, incidentally working with the highly creative wargamers in the Twin Cities area. Ernie is our jack of all trades, doing assembly, playtesting, and various other chores. Gary edits the various publications and prepares advertising. Brian does component research, sales work, and distribution of the newsletter. Donna is in charge of accounting, shipping, and records. This work was still mainly unpaid. As it now stands, the principals of TSR take nothing from the company. Every cent that is taken in goes back into the company in one form or another. All of us are quite willing to continue without any salary or profit distribution from the company for as long as necessary to ensure that the firm succeeds. However, this unpaid work would only be necessary for another month. Sales of D&D in the second quarter of 1975 amounted to 661, and as stock of D&D was almost depleted again, TSR would have Heritage Models run a third printing of the game, this time twice the amount at 2,000 copies. Heritage had them printed by the middle of June and would retain an additional 250 copies for themselves to sell to cover the TSR's printing costs. Just a few weeks after his interview with Lowry, with this promised source of revenue, Gygax would write in a letter to Arneson and working full-time for TSR now. In the July issue of the Strategic Review, they would announce that TSR had employed Gary Gygax full-time, and he is now responsible for all orders, billing, and accounting, a job that had previously been performed by Donna Kaye. This amounted to a salary of $80 per week, or $4,000 per year. By no means life-changing money, but enough for him to give up his job as a shoe cobbler. Likewise, Bloom would quit his position at Wisconsin Tool and Stamping and move to Lake Geneva a couple weeks later to work for TSR full-time as well, with the goal to start up the hobby shop that Gygax had spoken with Lowry about, a division of TSR to be known as TSR Hobbies. 1975 would be the first year of a new convention to rival Gen Con, hosted a month earlier in July by Avalon Hill, called Origins. As the focus of Gen Con shifted away from board and miniature wargames more towards the products being released by TSR, Avalon Hill decided to host their own convention with the focus on their board wargames, although they would invite TSR to host a small D&D event among the board wargaming tournaments. The first Origins would be held at Johns Hopkins University on the East Coast in Baltimore. At the convention, they celebrated the origins of the hobby by awarding the Charles S. Roberts Award, or Charlie's, honoring the founder of Avalon Hill. As stated in the general, the man who started it all. While the same issue would write that Origins proved that all of wargaming could get together behind a common cause to promote their hobby, they gave no consideration in their awards to TSR's products. TSR would come to Origins to challenge the establishment of the wargaming community. Along with D&D, TSR brought 2 new box sets to sell at Origins. Dave McGarry's Dungeon board game, which is notable as Avalon Hill had rejected printing it, and M.A.R. Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne. Both games were printed by a new printer employed by TSR, Patch Press. Dungeon sold for $12.50, and Petal Throne sold for the exorbitant price of $25, with its lengthy rulebook and 2 large maps. However, even at these price points, TSR sold out of the copies of Dungeon, Petal Throne, D&D, and Greyhawk that they had brought to Origins. Gygax hosted a seminar on D&D and ran a D&D tournament that would pit 8 teams of 15 players, each against the infamous Tomb of Horrors dungeon. How does one go about running the game of Dungeons & Dragons as a tournament? Taking inspiration from the scoring system of Dave McGarry's Dungeon board game, Gygax would award points based on the amount of treasure that each group of adventurers were able to extract from the dungeon, and choose who he thought was the most influential player from the group that extracted the most gold as the overall winner. One of the attendees was Mark Swanson, who wrote about the experience in Alarms and Excursions. Swanson criticized Gygax and his experience in the Tomb of Horrors, mainly focusing on the lack of wandering monsters and his rulings regarding elves being able to see hidden doors. He concluded, from the whole experience, I deduced a couple of lessons. Number 1, don't run D&D as a tournament. Number 2, always shatter plaster, unless you're in the dungeon of nasty-minded people such as I, who might put poison gas behind it. Number 3, play a Gygax game if you like pits, secret doors, and dungeon roulette. Play a game such as in A&E if you prefer monsters, talking, arguing, fighting, with chance to meet characters in a more exciting game. Of course, the game may not have been typical, but Gygax can defend himself. I felt no real desire for a second similar game. This is an interesting critique on what Swanson believed was Gygax's authorial intent for how D&D should be played from his experience with Gygax as the referee, as when we compare this experience of play to that written in The Giant's Bag, The Expedition to the Black Reservoir, or a recently published adventure in the June 1975 Wargamers Digest, The Magician's Ring, we see a style of play that is closer to what Swanson describes. Instead, it is likely that Gygax adapted Alan Lucian's Tomb of Horrors specifically to meet the constraints of running D&D in a tournament setting. However, for many adventurers playing D&D for the first time in this tournament, they would likely walk away with this as the authorial intent for how the game should be played. A dungeon filled with death traps designed to kill player characters, and bring this style back to their gaming groups. Gygax would also encounter a second imitator to Dungeons & Dragons at Origins. While he was able to secure Petal Throne, the same could not be said for Tunnels and Trolls, a slimmed-down work derivative of D&D, written by Ken St. Andre, printed by Flying Buffalo, and sold for $2. An early adopter of D&D, St. Andre was disappointed upon first reading it. When I had finished reading it, I was convinced of several things. 1, that the basic ideas were tremendous, even revolutionary, but that 2, as then written, the mechanics of play were nearly incomprehensible, and 3, that the game rules cost far more than they should, and 4, that 4, 8, 12, and 20-sided dice were too much to bother with. As I stood up, I vowed that I would create my own version of the game that I could play immediately, and that would correct all the other things that I thought were wrong with D&D. Dissatisfied with the rules for D&D, he would continue to work on revisions to the game until he felt that he had invented a distinct game. As he explains, so it is no longer Dungeons & Dragons. It is now Tunnels and Trolls. Our thanks go out to Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, who created the original D&D, but it is basically a completely different game, bearing about the same relationship to D&D as Careers does to Monopoly or Chevrolet does to Ford. But how fair of an assessment is this? Tunnels and Trolls is a game broken down into modes of wilderness and dungeon exploration and modes of combat, refereed by a dungeon master, where adventurers collect treasure and gain experience to progress in level while encountering randomly rolled monsters. Character creation involves rolling 3d6 to generate stats for strength, intelligence, dexterity, constitution, charisma, and luck, and players choose between careers of a warrior, magic user, or rogue, modeled respectively after Conan, Gandalf, and Kugel the Clever. As a slimmed down version of the game, there are no statistics for monsters or magic items, placing the burden of creating those on the dungeon master in order to save space. Did St. Andre really create a completely different game, one as distinct as careers in comparison to Monopoly? The changes made to the game seem no more significant to the variations published in APA L or Alarms and Excursions at the time. St. Andre would defend Tunnels and Trolls in 1979, writing, "One controversy that has come up is whether TNT has the right to imitate D&D. Ideas and systems are not copyrightable, nor is TNT in any respect a plagiarism of D&D. While one could debate the legal merits of this argument, the most notable part of this is that by publishing Tunnels and Trolls, St. Andre would set an early precedent for future competitors to D&D publishing their own version of the game." The July issue of the Strategic Review announced several updates for TSR, notably that they have formed a hobbies division, TSR Hobbies, with Brian in charge. TSR Hobbies would formally incorporate on July 19th, 1975. The plan was to sell fantasy miniatures and games by mail, not just things published by TSR, but other companies as well. We can see in this issue that they were already selling titles such as Siege of Minas Tirith, Battle of Helm's Deep, and Battle of the Five Armies. There was a heavy focus on selling miniatures, especially from companies like Minifigs, Derek Kriegspielers, and Screwbees, with plans to sell Heritage and McEwen, as miniature sales in 1975 were still more profitable than rule sales. Also in this issue, we see a promotion of the game Boot Hill and the appearance of some classic D&D monsters, such as the Shambling Mound and Naga. Gen Con 8 would be held a month after Origins in August 1975. In comparison to the scale and attendance of Origins at Johns Hopkins University on the East Coast, the scale of Gen Con hosted again at the Horticultural Hall in the Midwest seemed quaint. However, for many Midwestern gamers who couldn't make it to Origins, Gen Con would still remain the biggest event of the year. Just as the year before, Gen Con 8 would have a major focus on TSR products. Rob Kuntz ran a dungeon tournament on Friday, promoting Dave McGarry's new game, and Kuntz would run 3 Dungeons & Dragons tournament sessions throughout the rest of the weekend. The Strategic Review would later report that there was a paid attendance of about 900 gamers at the convention, and it was starting to become clear that even the modest Gen Con convention was outgrowing the size of the Horticultural Hall. Just as how Gen Con 7 had a large impact on the spread of D&D throughout the remainder of 1974, both Origins and Gen Con 8 would have a large impact in spreading D&D throughout the remainder of 1975. Origins arguably had the larger impact, as even though it was primarily focused on Avalon Hill products, it was still several times larger and allowed TSR to spread to new East Coast gamers who wouldn't have attended Gen Con. After both conventions, we can see a noticeable increase in fan engagement with D&D, which was reflected by its growing popularity in different zines. The zine Space Gamer, founded in 1975 by Howard Thompson to promote games for his company Metagaming Concepts, such as Stellar Conquest, had no intention on promoting D&D or TSR products. However, after surveying his readers, Howard found that D&D was second in popularity. And while he wouldn't profess to fully understanding it, since fantasy isn't our bag, he began to sell the game and asked for a reader-submitted review of the game for the next issue. The second issue of Space Gamer contained 2 glowing reviews for D&D, one from Tim Waddell and another from Andy Podea. By mid-1976, Metagaming Concepts began publishing fantasy games, and D&D would take up more of Space Gamer than any other game. The second issue of Space Gamer would also contain reviews for Petal Throne, Greyhawk, and War of Wizards. Another zine that would signal the spread of D&D was the British newsletter Owl and Weasel, based in London and published by the new company Games Workshop. The 6th issue of Owl and Weasel had a large banner reading Dungeons & Dragons Special Issue on its cover, with a detailed review, an example of play, and an examination of the game structure. In his review, Steve Jackson would note many of the same novelties of D&D that other gamers had noted. It is non-competitive in that each player is simply trying to further the development of his own character. A character does not cease to be when the night's adventure is over, but carries over from one game to another, accumulating experience points. Beyond the progression system, Jackson would also key in on the role of the referee, who acts as a god for the adventure, and that the beauty of the game is that any decision made by any of the players can be incorporated. While Jackson would lavish praise on the game, saying that they had become obsessed with the thing and that Dungeons and Dragons is a modern classic, he did criticize the price, although it is a soft criticism. $10 is too much to pay for 3 little books, but then it is such a good game, and it must have taken some time to develop. The growing sales throughout the summer of 1975 continued to further the ambitions of TSR, which at this point was still officially housed at the K residence. While the initial plan was for TSR to eventually absorb TSR Hobbies when it could afford to, the reverse would happen, and TSR Hobbies would absorb the original partnership. This corporate restructuring would allow Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom to buy out Donna Kay, who by this point had become disenfranchised with TSR and wanted out of the business. The stock allocation of TSR Hobbies on August 1st awarded Gygax with 150 shares and Bloom with 100 shares at a value of $100 per share. The shareholder agreement lists Gygax as the president of TSR Hobbies and Bloom as its secretary. As the restructuring was primarily caused by the unexpected death of Don Kay just a few months earlier, the shareholder agreement is heavily focused on what would happen in the event of the death of a shareholder. If a shareholder divested themselves from TSR, by death or otherwise, the stock would be offered to shareholders for purchase on a pro rata basis. So for instance, with Gygax holding 150 shares and Bloom holding 100 shares, if 25 shares became available, Gygax would be eligible to purchase 15 and Bloom 10. This would prevent the dilution of the holdings of the majority shareholders, protecting the company from outsider control. As Gygax held 2/3 of the shares in TSR, this would protect his control over the company. And as TSR owned D&D, protect his control over D&D. However, this would not last for long. While the corporate restructuring allowed Gygax and Bloom the opportunity to buy out Donna Kay, they still required the necessary capital to do so, and this would come as an investment by the Bloom family in September. Brian's father, Melvin Bloom, would buy 200 shares at a total cost of $20,000, and Brian Bloom would buy 140 shares for a total cash investment of $25,000. This would be enough to not only buy out Donna Kay, but also secure a new base of operation, stock up the hobby shop, and publish new products. Melvin Bloom was not a gamer, and retired from his position at Wisconsin Tool and Die, viewing TSR simply as a financial investment, and would be a silent partner. His son Brian would effectively control the voting power of his shares, and while Gygax was still TSR's leader as the president, legally speaking, Gygax was now a minority shareholder in the company. TSR Hobbies purchased the assets of the original partnership on September 26, 1975, and moved them from the Kay family residence into Gygax's basement temporarily until they could purchase their own building. This transfer included all contractual rights to the rules and games, including the original royalty agreement of the partnership and revised 10% royalty agreement for D&D signed in April, terms that would be the source of a lawsuit in years to come. This transition occurred at the end of the third quarter of 1975, a quarter that marked another high of D&D sales at 1,371 copies sold. Just like in 1974, a big reason for this increase in sales is likely due to the summer conventions of Origins and Gen Con, introducing D&D to new gamers who would bring the game home to their gaming groups and continue to spread it around the country. Donna Kay would officially be bought out on September 26, and they would replace the original GK logo for TSR with the image of Greg Bell's Lizard Man for TSR Hobbies. They would also hire the first employees outside of Gygax and Bloom on October 1st, Terry Kuntz and Tim Kask. Kask would take over as editor of the Strategic Review, but like other employees of the company, would work in a multitude of areas. Tim will also do some design work, shipping, floor sweeping, etc., just as the rest of us must do, Gygax affirmed. For Gygax, the big name to bring on board TSR was D&D's co-creator Dave Arneson. But Arneson was reluctant to move to Lake Geneva and work for TSR. Due in part to the previous unpaid royalties while publishing through Guide on Games, Gygax cutting the royalties for Barker's Petal Throne, and the contentious negotiations of the royalty agreement for Dave Wesley's new Valley Forge game, Arneson demanded an employment contract with TSR. The contract would be sent to Arneson on October 10th, stipulating that Arneson would work for TSR as creative artist to create manuscripts and game components involved in the production of games and game rules for the employer, though the precise services of the employee may be extended or curtailed from time to time at the discretion of the employer. The contract would cover an initial term of 6 months, with an optional extension and a salary of $125 per week. Instead of royalties for his design work, Arneson would receive 30 shares of TSR stock, valued in total at $3,000, in exchange for all rights to 6 of his works in progress: Blackmoor, Ships of the Line, Naval Orders of Battle, Crusader, Maverick, and PT Boat. Arneson returned the contract unsigned on October 14th, with numerous objections. Namely, that the contract would deprive me from seeking any work within a broad spectrum of areas extending from history to model making, and that the contract would deprive me of all rights to original work completed but unsold prior to the date of my employment, as well as work submitted to but rejected by TSR Inc. after the date of my employment. He also found the payment too low, roughly $2.60 an hour, when minimum wage in 1976 would be $2.30, and no provisions for raises or bonuses. Brian Bloom would respond to Arneson on behalf of TSR, writing in a letter back to Arneson, "We were very surprised and disappointed that you did not find the contract satisfactory. There is no question of going any higher on the benefits or salary. You'd be making more than either Gary or I do. It was also disappointing to see how little trust you displayed in us with regard to the wording of your contract, your idea in the first place. Tim Kask moved all the way from Carbondale, Illinois to work with us. Although he's a graduate in communications, he is not receiving more than a token salary and the chance to get in on the ground floor of this operation, and he has no contract of any sorts." Bloom did not indicate that there would be any further negotiations with Arneson regarding his employment, but did include that "we hope that you will continue to submit your design efforts to us for publication." Arneson would phone Gygax 2 days later on October 20th, and Gygax clarified much of the misunderstanding between Arneson and Bloom. He promised that there would be an opportunity for raises and bonuses, if possible, based on the sales of products. They agreed to meet in person to discuss the details, but even as late as November, Arneson still had concerns with joining TSR Hobbies. He refused to join until they had secured a workplace, and what would happen with the unpublished material for Blackmoor. Arneson wanted to retain the right to publish any unpublished material from his Blackmoor supplement, as it would be unfair for TSR to own and control this material. However, Gygax countered that much of Blackmoor had to be rewritten, namely by Tim Kask, and that Arneson would be profiting off of this work, so in exchange, TSR would hold on to this for eventual use in some manner. In the end, Arneson would sign an agreement for Blackmoor on November 18th, receiving a 0% royalty, but 30 shares of TSR Hobbies, now the 4th largest shareholder behind Brian Bloom at 420, Gygax at 334, and Melvin Bloom at 200. While Arneson would join TSR Hobbies, these tense negotiations would strain the initial relationship between himself and Brian Bloom, and continue to strain his relationship with Gygax. November would also see the 4th printing of Dungeons & Dragons, a printing of 5,000 more copies to keep up with the ever-growing demand of the game, especially internationally, as now Games Workshop had begun selling the game. This printing would be done by Patch Press after a positive experience that TSR had with them printing Dungeon and Petal Throne. They abandoned the wood grain box of the previous 3 printings, instead printing it as a white box with the cover image printed directly on the cover. The cover image was also changed, replacing Greg Bell's Rearing Rider with Dave Sutherland's Dungeon Scene. TSR would use Patch Press for the rest of the printings of this version of Dungeons & Dragons. The strategic review moved from a quarterly release schedule to bi-monthly, and the 4th issue teased an upcoming successor, The Dragon is Coming. It also mentioned the hiring of Dave Arneson to TSR Hobbies, writing, "Dave Arneson will be coming down from St. Paul soon to join our regular design staff. His function will be to help us coordinate our efforts with freelance designers, handle various research projects, and produce material like a gristmill. Crack, snap, work faster there, Dave." The most anticipated of these releases, of course, would be Blackmoor. One of the main reasons for the high anticipation of Blackmoor was due to its constant writing and publication delays. Gygax had written as far back as March in a letter to GPGPN that "Dave Arneson tells me his Blackmoor, D&D Supplement 2, is being put into final draft now," and in fall in Owl and Weasel that Arneson already held heaps of manuscripts and games waiting in the wings, so to speak, for TSR to get into print. Yet by November, it was still not finished. The 4th issue of the Strategic Review prematurely advertised Blackmoor for sale, so in the next issue, Cask apologized to the many readers who prepaid for Blackmoor and have been forced to endure an indeterminable delay. However, Cask would announce in this issue that Blackmoor is finally done and in the hands of the printers. We know it's late, but you wouldn't believe me if I listed all the problems we had with it. Suffice it to say that I've been bloodied as an editor by Blackmoor. Gygax assigned Tim Cask to work as the editor for Blackmoor to avoid any further delays and get the supplement completed as soon as possible. Bloom wrote in that previously discussed letter to Arneson that about 100 or so man-hours had been put into Blackmoor so far to make it a usable design. Your name will appear on the cover as sole author, naturally, though inside we will give proper credit to those who contributed ideas and aided in the total rewrite. Sure enough, Blackmoor is credited to Gygax, Cask, and Rob Kuntz, as well as Marsh, for suggestions and ideas. Gygax would write in 1978, "Truth be known, Dave Arneson actually wrote about 25% of Blackmoor, and that quarter had to be rewritten by Rob Kuntz and Tim Cask. Brian Bloom and I authored the other half of the work, which included 2 new subclasses, Monk, a subclass of Cleric, and Assassin, a subclass of Thief. While it is hard to verify these percentages, there is a surviving draft outline of Arneson's Blackmoor with a table of contents that bears almost no resemblance to the final published version of the supplement. However, Gygax would say that the major sections authored by Arneson are the combat system and the maps of the Temple of the Frog. In the foreword to Blackmoor, Gygax expresses high praise for Arneson as the innovator of the dungeon adventure concept, creator of ghastly monsters, and inscrutable dungeon master par excellence. I cannot recommend him more highly than simply saying that I would rather play in his campaign than any other." Gygax reminds the reader in the introduction that the Blackmoor supplement says little about the Blackmoor castle itself, similar to how Greyhawk says little about the city or castle of Greyhawk. Instead of being a setting book, like Greyhawk, it is a rule supplement. Some notable inclusions include the subclasses of Monk and Assassin, a hit location combat system, new underwater themed monsters and magic items, and rules for underwater adventures and diseases. However, arguably the biggest innovation in Blackmoor is the 20-page scenario Temple of the Frog. While Underworld and Wilderness Adventure provided a sample dungeon legend, the Temple of the Frog provided referees with all of the information they would need to run the scenario for players, including lore and backstory to the area of Loch Lomond and motivations of NPCs. While the specific scenario may not appeal to all referees, it would still prove useful as a sample for referees on how to run the game. For TSR, it marked a turning point for D&D publications, opening up the avenue of commercially publishing scenarios for D&D. Reactions to Blackmoor from the D&D community were not nearly as favorable as those towards Greyhawk. Writing on behalf of the MIT gamers, Swanson wrote that local reaction to the new TSR supplement, Blackmoor, is generally negative. Not that it isn't useful, with a good example of how to set up a dungeon/wilderness area, useful sage and assassin rules, but that A&E has better monsters, as well as more words. Steve Rose wrote, "Compare that with Greyhawk. Blackmoor is fine and dandy, but it's like expecting Pepsi and getting RC. Like wanting Asimov and getting Ellison. Or, to cease with these never-ending analogies, like expecting Greyhawk and getting Blackmoor." Shaw felt similarly, writing, "I guess what it boils down to is I was expecting Greyhawk and got Blackmoor." Owl and Weasel had a bit more of a positive review for Blackmoor. Most of the review is dedicated to simply going over the contents of Blackmoor, although it does give a special notice to the usefulness of the Temple of the Frog. It ends the review by stating, although perhaps not quite as useful as Greyhawk, which had all the combat and magic tables, there is nevertheless some valuable stuff in there, and the Temple of the Frog is a must-buy for any game master who isn't quite sure whether his dungeons are designed the way TSR intended them to be. A few months after Blackmoor was published, Space Gamer would publish a survey of their readers rating publications on a scale from 1 to 10. D&D and Petal Throne tied with a rating of 7.7, Greyhawk received a 7.4, and Blackmoor would receive a 5.2, even below Tunnels and Trolls at 5.5. For TSR, even in spite of the poor reviews and reception, Blackmoor sold well. This would prove that even a half-baked D&D product would sell, and people would still write about it and react to it, furthering the conversation and promotion of D&D within various zines. Even if D&D was too important to leave to Gary Gygax, TSR as a company was proving itself to be critic-proof. By the end of 1975, TSR would finalize moving into their new base of operations, a house in Lake Geneva at 723 William Street, although the house would require much in the way of renovations. As Gygax wrote to Arneson, the shop is going slowly. Needs new roof, new heating plant, new wiring, some plumbing repairs, painting after plaster repairs, carpeting, stock, and miscellaneous fixtures and furnishing. Most of this work was completed by Terry Kuntz. The William Street house provided TSR sufficient storage space for their growing print runs and a place to accommodate their growing staff. As 1975 came to an end, D&D had sold over 4,000 copies, with about 3,000 of those sales being in the last year alone. While TSR brought in roughly $60,000 throughout 1975, most of the revenue went to printing costs, royalties, and their new facility, with the remaining being enough to hire and pay a handful of employees slightly over minimum wage to create games. TSR had no plans on slowing down for 1976, with a slate of diverse games planned for release. Thanks in no small part to the leadership of Gygax, TSR was able to weather the disruption caused by the death of Don Kay at the beginning of the year, a disruption that could have easily resulted in the end of TSR and D&D. While Gygax had only planned on being TSR's rules editor and game designer, by the end of the year, he proved that he was capable of achieving so much more than that. Thank you so much for watching the 4th episode of my series on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it, one book at a time. What did you think about the story of how Dungeons & Dragons spread throughout 1975, and the community reaction to it, along with its first 2 supplements, Greyhawk and Blackmoor? Did anything about the growth and change of TSR throughout 1975, and its shift from a partnership to a company, surprise you? Let me know in those comments down below. In the next episode, we'll take a look at how Gygax continued to grow TSR, as well as the publication of D&D's next expansion booklets of Eldritch Wizardry, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, and Swords and Spells throughout 1976. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Kevbot, and I will see you in the next video.